thing to understand about the way the brain works is that it's what I call a team of rivals, which means you have many different networks in the brain that are all trying to drive towards their own thing. And you can argue with yourself, you can cuss at yourself, you can contract with yourself, and so on. So this is the way that all decisions actually get made, and this is something that neuroscience has been able to make clear over the last 20 years, is that you have these different competing networks in the brain. The interesting thing when you meet with a drug addict and talk with them is that part of their brain really wants the drug, part of their brain doesn't want it. They know all the reasons that they shouldn't do the drug, economically, socially, in terms of employment opportunities, other opportunities in their life. They are very aware of all the costs that this has had to them. The idea with the prefrontal workout is the following. This part called the prefrontal lobe, which is the part behind your forehead, that's the part of the brain that's very good at simulating the future and saying, okay, here are the reasons that I shouldn't do the drugs. You have other parts of your brain that want the drug right now. So the idea that we started working on is taking people who are addicted to drugs, putting them in the scanner, and we image the networks in their brain that are involved in both of those. So we show them pictures of cocaine, for example, and we say, all right, go ahead and crave the cocaine. That lights up particular networks in the brain. Then we say, okay, think about all the reasons why you don't want to do the cocaine, all the costs that this has had to you. And we encourage people to think in that way, and that lights up these networks in the brain. Then what we do, now that we have the networks for that individual's brain, is we show them pictures of cocaine, and we ask them to figure out how to control their craving. So we put on the screen a speedometer that goes from crave to suppress, and what they're doing is they try to figure out what they need to do in order to move that needle. In other words, the needle, we're measuring the activity in these networks, and that's what determines where the needle is. And they're trying to figure out how to move that needle. So what they're getting is immediate feedback about what's happening in their brain, which is very new and unique. I mean, to be able to measure what's going on inside the brain and give someone visual feedback about that decision making. We're not changing anything fundamentally about the person. We're simply allowing them to figure out how to make better long-term decision making. 60 years ago, there was a movement to have prefrontal lobotomies, as it's called, where a surgeon would go in and essentially scramble up the prefrontal lobes. And this was actually a treatment that was done on some people in prison. And the idea is that it would make them less aggressive and so on. And that has, I think, real problems from a libertarian point of view about whether we should ever give the government permission to mess with somebody's brain. The nice part about what we're talking about now with the prefrontal workout is that it only works if somebody wants to change themselves. As I said, with all drug addicts, if you talk to them, they have both of these voices telling them what they should do. And when they're in a moment of reflection about their lives, they really don't want to do the drugs. It's just that when somebody offers them the drug, they just can't resist. It's right there. And so all we're doing is giving people the tools they need to learn what they need to do to be able to resist. And so the idea with moving the needle is that you're surfing through your mental space and you're figuring out what it takes to allow the long term to win, whether or not you're even consciously aware of how you're doing it. The interesting part is that people can learn they are the ones reshaping their brain. They are figuring out, only if it's meaningful to them, how to do that. Here are the tools that you need if you want to learn how to do this, if you want to learn how to do this exercise. So from a libertarian point of view, I think this is a very important distinction, that we're simply giving them the tools to decide their own direction, their own fate. I think the ethical issues are minimal with something like this. As long as the system offers that in a way that is, even, and says, look, instead of going to jail, here's this other opportunity, then the nice part is it's cheaper for the government. I mean, it's less expensive functional magnetic resonance imaging is about $500 an hour, which is expensive, but that's nothing compared to jail. I mean, jail's really expensive. I think there's definitely a future. The current brain imaging technologies that we use, it's called functional magnetic resonance imaging, and it's the best thing that we have right now in 2018, but it won't be the best thing in 5 years or 10 years. And this will become a pretty standard thing to be able to help people, obviously not just in the criminal system with drugs, but even things like obesity or whatever. And so it's always this battle between the long and short-term decision making. One of the big questions in neuroscience is, do we have free will? And we certainly feel like we have free will. You feel like you come into a situation, you're free to make a decision, and in fact the legal system that is in Italy and in America and most of the world rests on this assumption that we have free will. But in fact, from a neuroscience point of view, it's not clear that we have that. And this is because in the brain, you have about 100 billion neurons. These are the main cell types that carry information. And every neuron is driven by other neurons. So everything in the brain is driving other things. And it's not clear where there's anything extra to get in the puff of breath of the soul or something else. This is very challenging for us when we think about what that means for the legal system, because essentially what it means is who you are is a function of your genetics and every experience you've ever had, and these are intertwined. But that's the question, is do we actually have free will, or are we a function of our genes and experience only? Everything that we are learning from the point of view of neuroscience suggests that free will doesn't exist, because everything seems to be sort of part of a machine. It's extremely sophisticated biological machine, but it appears that it's not clear where free will would come from. What's clear is that even if we have some, it's a very small player in the grand scheme of how we make decisions. And the reason we know that is because of the thousands of medical cases that we see every day happening in hospitals and clinics around us, which is to say, somebody gets a brain tumor that changes their behavior, somebody gets dementia, changes their behavior, somebody has a stroke, it changes who they are. And so what we know for certain is that you are completely dependent on what's happening in your brain, and when that changes even a little bit, you change. True if you do drugs or alcohol. This is true if you take certain medications. You're changing the chemistry, that changes decision making. So this is what gets to the heart of this issue about blameworthiness, which is when somebody commits a crime, can we say you are to be blamed for this? And this is different than the question of culpability. The legal system does and should ask about culpability, which is, did you do this crime? Are you guilty of the crime? Fine, here's what we do from here. But the question about blame, about saying, is this your fault that you did that, might not make sense as a question anymore as we understand more and more about what's happening under the hood. If we do not have free will, I think the reason this challenges the way we think about the legal system is that when we look at that criminal, we all want to punish that person. We feel like that guy has made evil decisions and he deserves to be really punished. And the question is that the right sort of approach, as opposed to saying, all right, look, we may need to get this guy off the streets. I mean, that's fine. That is a clear purpose of the legal system. But can we concentrate more on rehabilitation and what would be required for helping this person rather than the punishment piece of it? And so one of the places this leads us, I think, is this idea of a forward-looking legal system instead of a backwards-looking one. Backwards-looking is what we currently have, where we say, look, you committed this crime, that's 5 years in prison. A forward-looking legal system says, look, you committed this crime, here's how we're going to route you through the legal system. A biological explanation does not equal exculpation. It doesn't mean that people get off the hook. What it gives us is the capacity to do rational sentencing, by which I mean looking at the person in front of the bench and saying, wow, this person is really dangerous, we're going to put him away for a longer time. This person is really not dangerous. He was drunk, he did something stupid, but all the indicators we have are that it's really unlikely he would do this again, maybe a shorter sentence. It also gives us the capacity to set up better incentives and deterrence on a societal level. And it gives us the capacity to do customized rehabilitation as we get better at understanding what's going on in the brain. To say, look, what's going on with you, you've committed this crime, but we see now that you have a brain tumor, or you have schizophrenia, or you have a drug addiction, or whatever it is. It gives us a better way to say, look, we're trying to solve this problem rather than simply saying you are an evil person, to say, if we want to get this problem solved, here's what we do with it. That's the idea. The reason we have a legal system is to make sure that society runs smoothly. And we set down certain rules and say, for example, you can't murder somebody. So if someone murders another person, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they had free will or not free will in doing it. We as a society need to do the right thing to keep the rest of society safe. So we would put that person away. The question is the way in which we do that. Do we put that person away for life? Sometimes a person is very dangerous, and that would be exactly the right thing. In other cases, somebody would be less dangerous, and we might say, wow, that was a very odd circumstance. For example, in America, we have a notion of crime of passion. There must be some equivalent in Italy, but the idea is, he caught his wife in bed with another lover, and so he murdered him. But we understand that that's a very unusual circumstance, and given this guy's life history, he's not a murderer by disposition. It's very unlikely for that ever to happen again. He might get a shorter sentence. So it's not that the judge acquits everyone and says, no, it doesn't matter, it's not your fault, because what matters is keeping a good society, keeping a society safe. I guess what I'm sensing here is that there is a difference between what we mean by blameworthy from the legal point of view and from the neuroscience point of view. From the neuroscience point of view, I don't think that there's any meaningful way to say anyone is blameworthy for anything or creditworthy for anything. But from the legal point of view, it's more clear what is meant by that. I mean, if you crash your car into a crowd of pedestrians, it's different if you were having an epileptic seizure versus you were drunk. If you cuss at people in the street, it's different if you're just being aggressive or if you have a disorder like Tourette's syndrome that's causing you to do that. That's what the legal system is thinking about in terms of blameworthiness. Now, the reason that you got drunk or were being aggressive to this crowd in the first place, fundamentally it may not be that you are blameworthy for that from the neuroscience point of view, but that's what the legal system, of course, means by it. This thing about distinguishing different levels of whether they should be able to control their behavior or not. There is an open question about whether society can handle having a system where we don't punish somebody, because we have a lot of bloodlust. This comes from our evolutionary history. It was very useful for us if somebody misbehaves to feel like you really want to punish them. And this is something we're always stuck with. an example that I find interesting is exactly 50 years ago, there was a shooter at the University of Texas in Austin who killed a number of people from the tower. He shot people randomly, killed 16 people, wounded 39. And it came out that he had a small tumor in his brain, but people didn't really talk about this at the time, and it's only more recently, sort of 45 years later, that I wrote this book Incognito, where I talked about the fact that Charles Whitman had this tumor. And I wondered about that. I wondered why, even though it was in the medical reports at the time, no one really took on that topic. And I think it's because it was just too painful, right? Here was a man who murdered a bunch of people randomly, and the idea that he had something going on in his brain made society feel like, well, is that an excuse? Are we supposed to forgive him? And so on. And it's just a really tough tension for any of us to deal with. I mean, just as an example, there was this recent shooting in Las Vegas here by a guy named Stephen Paddock. I have a suspicion that he probably had something called frontotemporal dementia, and that could be combined with other things too. He could have had a drinking problem, a medication problem, a drug problem. Could have been all these things, whatever. But it was so strange that Stephen Paddock did what he did, because he's a guy who had no criminal record and had apparently been very nice to his family and so on. It is almost impossible to talk about this sort of thing because it's so painful to the society and to the victims of that crime to even hear that somebody is talking about, well, what went wrong with his brain, because their first interpretation is that's making an excuse for this guy. And Stephen Paddock, as it turns out, was killed at the event, but had he not been killed, people would want to punish him, and I get that. I would want to punish him too. Compatible legal system would not send people to prison. Why? Because prison is very useful as a societal deterrent, for making somebody think, okay, wow, I really want to rob that old lady over there, but if I do, I run the risk of going to jail for 3 years. It's a very useful deterrent in that way, and that's why our prison system will and should continue to exist. The problem is, prison is not for everybody. It's not useful for everybody. And in America, we have the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. We stick a larger percentage of our population in prison than any other country. The reason that doesn't always make sense is because there are many people who don't respond to the deterrent of prison in the way that you or I would. I mean, I don't want to go to prison, so I'm going to not do that crime. But not everyone responds that way. Why? Because there are 100 things that can go wrong with the brain. You can have damage to the brain of all sorts, or you can have maldeveloped parts of your brain that think about the long-term consequences. Obviously, drugs change brain decision-making. There's a spectrum of IQ. There's 100 different things that can make it so that that do make it so that people are very different in their decision making. So the question is prison the right solution for everybody? And this is where I think a forward-looking legal system would have some better distinction and refinement. We're not going to imagine that prison is a one-size-fits-all solution, but instead we're going to see if there are rehabilitative strategies that are meaningful in the situation, that we can help you to rehabilitate, to get you back out as quickly as is useful. So just as an example, for people who are addicted to drugs, if you take somebody who is arrested for drug addiction and you put them in prison, first of all, there's a big drug ring in prison, so you can still get drugs. And the bigger problem is, once you send somebody to jail, you break their social circles and you break their economic opportunities. And so we have a major recidivism rate in this country where people end up returning to prison. Instead, you could take those people and put them into a meaningful rehabilitation program, such that instead of saying, if you do drugs, you are a bad person who needs to be off the streets, instead you say, look, we're going to help you in some way. And I think from a cost perspective, it's actually better for governments to do this. So it's better for society, and it's better from a cost perspective also. Obviously, a big one in the American legal system has to do with mental illness. So the estimate is that about 30% of our population in prisons has mental illness. We used to have institutions in this country, mental institutions, and then several decades ago, those were all shut down. This process called deinstitutionalization. And the reason that happened is because those institutions were being run very poorly and people were essentially spending their whole lives in those institutions. So anyway, the government shut those down, and most of that mentally ill population just flowed into the prison system. And now our prison system is our mental health care system. There are also different kinds of crimes that people commit where doing something other than putting them in jail would be helpful. For example, with prostitution. Prostitution is a very different kind of crime than other sorts of crimes. And what some counties here in the United States are doing is spinning off specialized prostitution courts, where what you're trying to do is help the women to find other kinds of jobs so that they have some outlet they can do besides that. Some counties are setting up specialized drug courts, so that instead of saying, look, you did this drug, you're going to prison for this amount of time, instead you say, okay, what are the rehabilitative strategies that are available here for you? So the judges and juries have specialization in understanding drugs and the treatments available, or specializations in prostitution, specializations in mental health, these sorts of things. I would just add that typically these things get set up only when counties run out of money, which is a real shame. So what happens, they run out of money and they think, gosh, we don't have any more room in the jail and we need more room. And so they think, gosh, now we have to think of something smart. And that's when they start setting up these specialized court systems so that they don't just send everybody to prison. So there's this question about what is a normal brain, and the answer is it's very difficult to say what a normal brain is, because brains exist on a big distribution along any axis that you can possibly think of, whether that's skill at playing chess or playing basketball or swimming or having empathy or being able to visualize things in your head or do math problems or any possible thing we can measure. There's a huge spectrum. And we tend to fall into this notion of thinking, well, okay, there's the normal brain, and then there's these outlying things. And in fact, we have terms for these, and it's hard to even escape these terms. But in neuroscience, for example, we say, oh, that person has schizophrenia or autism or a drug addiction or whatever it is. But in fact, everyone is on a spectrum. And in fact, in the latest versions of the medical manuals, what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, there's this growing understanding that everything is on a spectrum. Okay, so what that means is there is no normal brain, but there's sort of these rough borders we can draw where we say, look, everyone within these borders understands the rules well enough that we can get along as a society and keep moving things forward. If you're outside of that, and you say, oh, look, I think a better idea is to go murder this person so that I can get what I want in this case, then unfortunately as a society we have to face this decision of, okay, well, we're going to build prisons and we're going to put you away because we can't function if there are people doing that kind of behavior. One of the things I'm very excited about is we have collected tens of millions of crime records from all around the United States. Now, the way we did this has taken us 5 years of work now to do this, but the way we did it is we used what's called the Freedom of Information Act, which is a law that was passed some years ago that says, look, public crime is public record, so you should be able to access this. So we called up counties and states all over the place and said we would like all of your prison records, all of your crime records. And they all had excuses, and they said, well, you're gonna have to pay for the database programmer's time. So we did, we paid for all that stuff. We finally got the records from every different place that we got them. It's in a totally different format, just a database, tables dumped and so on. So what we did, the reason we've taken 5 years on this is because we have a team of lawyers and computer programmers, and we took all of that, translated it into a common currency, both in terms of the computer using it, but also in terms of 30 general crime categories and 150 specific crime categories. So what this has allowed us to do is have records from all over the United States where we can say, look, we want to know about a particular type of crime, let's say murder or rape or computer crimes or whatever. We want to be able to look at that across the states from 1977 to present. 77 is essentially when the first databases got started, when all this stuff got computerized. So this is why we have these millions and millions of records. The point is so that we can assess the efficacy of different pieces of legislation. For starters, we can say, look, in 1989, this rule was passed, this law was passed. Did that drive crime down in that category? Or did it drive it up? Or did it have no effect? Or did it shift crime into a different category? It allows us for the first time to be able to really quantify which laws make sense. The reason being that so many laws are passed in a moment of emotion. Some terrible crime happens, usually against a child, and there's a big push to pass some crime. Usually the new law gets the child's name attached to it. And the question is it actually a good law? And sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but it's hard to know that. So this gives us the tools to be able to do it. What we have done is set this up with a public interface so that anybody can access this and look at these tens of millions of crime records in a very easy way, so that reporters can look at this easily, lawmakers can look at this, academics can look at this. Everyone has access to the same data. You can plot it any which way you want it just by clicking it. It's super easy. And what that allows us to do is take all these records that were essentially hidden away from the public and expose it to the light. And that means that when laws get passed from now on, it'll be based on data instead of based on whatever the local emotions are of the moment.